wanted to do kind of a short lightning talk tonight for everyone. And for those that know me, yes, I am known for talking a lot about Git, and there's actually a little bit of Git in this tonight too. But I really wanted to share just like some fun things with like small tools that do things really well. And tonight's talk is actually about a gem that I built actually a long time ago, but I actually used it for a lot of open source stuff. And I'm trying to twist Paul's arm to eventually bring it into our stack at work. But it's for version release management. So it's just a nice CLI on top of Git for tagging and so forth. Oh, thanks. Okay. So let's jump into that tonight and kind of talk through the problems of why this kind of came into being. One of them is just lack of automation for dealing with versions and getting those out the door. I've seen a lot of people do it kind of like manually or just not have a great way of actually doing that. So this kind of helps with the automation of that. Gives you a way from the command line to actually automate and get those releases out the door. Also lack of communication. So in terms of communication, you kind of got three stakeholders. You've got your development team that you want to communicate for the releases that you're pushing out. You've got your stakeholders in the company, which might be your project managers and your and higher ups. And then you've got your customers. And this kind of helps with all three of those, although the latter two kind of get fuzzy because usually you need somebody to take your Git commits from your project as you're pushing out releases and usually take those and kind of, kind of enhances a little bit. So for customers, right, it needs to be not too technical. And maybe for your project managers and staff within the company, maybe they need kind of a mix of technical and non-technical. And then also just being consistent. One of the nice things with any engineering team is always being really consistent on what you produce, right? Getting your versions out the door, getting them on time, and getting them consistently organized and produced. So the solution here is to bring in something like Milestoner, which is, again, a nice little Ruby gem that you can install and gives you command line access. The other nice thing about this is it works really well paired with GitCop, because if you have GitCop as your linter to have your team have high quality Git commits, and they're consistently written and put together, then that makes the automation through Milestoner a lot easier for getting these release notes out the door. So to install it, like anything, is just really easy. Or if you have an existing project, you can just use bundler add and add it in that way. Again, it is a command line tool. So once you launch it from the command line, you'll have these options available to you. And I just want to walk through a few of these. The first one is being able to grab all your commits. So when you're tagging in your Git repository, really all this is kind of Milestoner on the top of that is just a veneer, a CLI to make managing tags a lot easier. So if you've tagged your projects with each version that you've put out, what you can do with the commits here is just do Milestoner -- commits, and that'll give you the running tally of commits that you haven't produced yet. So it's kind of a nice check to see where you're at as a team. Are you ready to release? Are you not? Where are you at with things? Do things look good? The main one that you'll be using all the time, though, is publish, because that allows you to bundle up all those commits for your next release, tag them, and then immediately push them to your Git repository. Config, we'll get into this a little later. This is how you can configure Milestone to behave a little differently, whether globally or for your personal project. Help and version are just information about the CLI itself. And then these last two, push and tag, are basically if you wanted to step through tagging and pushing yourself manually. But the publish command does the same thing. It's just broken out for you in case you need it. So I want to focus on these two because these are kind of the main things that make Milestoner quite powerful. The first one being able to get the commits, right? So what this looks like is a bit like this. Here I have an example project that I'm toying around with. And it has a bunch of commits, just a bunch of maintenance stuff I've been doing on it. Not too terribly exciting, right? But notice the consistency here. We've got fixed grouping, we've got an added grouping, we've got an updated grouping, and a removed grouping. What's really nice about that is, and you can configure this in Milestoner, what you want that order to be, but it's alpha sorted and grouped by those. And again, this gets back to the consistency problem, making sure that you're getting those release notes and capturing that consistently and every time. And again, you can dictate what that format is for your team. But out of the box, that's what this kind of looks like, that grouping. The other thing you want to do is, once you're ready to publish, then you're going to go ahead and give it a version and just publish it. What's really nice about this is it adheres strongly to semantic versioning. So no funny business here. It's always a major, minor, and patch version. This also is heavily influenced by Elm. If you've ever done anything with an Elm, when you publish packages there, they are extremely strict. There's just no way you can get anything into the Elm package registry unless it's semantically versioned. So I adhere to that very strictly on the Ruby side of things too. I think it's a really cool thing that I picked up from the Elm side of things. What this looks like then, when you publish consistently like this, is if you look at all your tags on your project, you'll have something that kind of looks like this, where you have your versions, the date in which they released, who authored them, and then the version label. And this, by the way, is just being generated through this command. I know that's a lot, but this is the git command to produce that. I'll have these slides up online, so you can just grab this code later, so don't worry about trying to capture any of this if you're interested. But I highly recommend aliasing this in your bash scripts if you have to, if you do a lot from the command line, because this is a nice handy tool to get that kind of version information quickly. So, excuse me, if we go and we look at something that we just published, so like let's say the 063 version I just published, if I look at this through Git, right, using git tag verify, this is what's built for us through Milestoner. It's doing all this for us automatically. Again, it's a nice just glorified wrapper around git tagging, right? But I've automated all this for you through a CLI. So one of the main things is yes, the tag matches. You can see who tagged it, in this case, me. You can see the version label that was generated by Milestoner, and then the commits that make up the release notes. Those are put into the body of the tag message. So just like your git commits, where you have a message and a body, in git tagging, it's the same thing. It's a message and a body. And in this case, these are the commits that comprise that tag. So those are automatically put in there for you. And then lastly, because I feel really strongly about, strong opinions again, about having tags that are verified and signed, I'm just having a GPG signature on this. So anybody looking at the project, especially open source stuff, right, they can know that those tags are verified by me. They have my GPG signature on it. Now, out of the box, Milestoner turns this off, but I'll show you how to turn it on later. So Milestoner, that's kind of Milestoner in a nutshell, but some of the things that I think is kind of interesting about this is kind of peeling this back a bit, is looking at some other smaller tools that you might be interested in, which make up Milestoner. One of them is Versionaire, is a gem. We'll get into that in a little bit, that makes the versioning possible. Then XDG for configuration of Milestoner, and I'll get into that as well. And then Runcom, which actually sits on top of XDG. Both of those are configuration management type stuff, so I just want to talk about those a little bit, just in case you might find those interesting for your various projects. So starting with Versionaire, it gives a nice way for you to have a struct or a whole value object within your Ruby programs, so you can get semantic versioning right away. And what this means is semantic versioning, if you're not fully familiar with it, is the first part is always your major, then you have your minor for minor changes, things that are not breaking the API. Major is for your major changes, right? Like you've broken the API, you've removed things, stuff like that. And then patch information, which is basically just fixes. Doesn't break anything, doesn't add anything, just fixes something. So from the command line, what that looks like if you jump into the IRB console, is you can type Versionaire, version. And this syntax, by the way, is very similar in Ruby to the casting that you do with like integer or string or float. So Versionaire behaves in the same way. In this case, I pass it in a hash, right? I give it the major, the minor, and the patch. I can also give it an array, and it'll cast it that way too. Same object comes back. And I can also give it a string, and it'll go ahead and cast it for you that way too. What's really nice about that you're seeing here is these are structs, but they're whole value structs. So all three of these are equal to each other in equality in Ruby, because they're equal by the value of the major, minor, and patch elements that make up the object versus object equality. So really nice. So you can get good, strongly typed versions in your Ruby code. You can also have immutability, because these are immutable by default, and thread safe. So just FYI. XGG then is what makes Milestoner configurable. Oh, sorry, Paul.
The Versionaire structs, are they comparable to? Will it do greater than and less than correctly for Semver?
Yeah, actually, thanks, Paul. That's a good point. These are all comparable as well. So you can also do a comparison, whether one version is higher or lower than the other one. And you can also do something kind of similar, sort of fun. And it's in the README if you guys ever want to get into it and want to use something like this, but you can also do subtraction and addition. So if you want to add one version to another or subtract one version, you can do some math characteristics in there too. So yeah, Dan.
What's a use case where you ever want to subtract a version?
So where I'm kind of thinking of going with that and some of the tooling I'm kind of thinking in the future is, let's say that you want to do some automation with Milestoner and you want to do a version bump. You might want to just pass it in like, here's the minor. Just add like minor +1, right? Or up the patch or bump the major.
You're not adding two different versions together. You're more like saying, hey, increment the major or increment the minor.
Yes, but the way the math would work is if you had 1, 2, 3 in this case, and you gave it plus 1.00, you get a 2, 2, 3 version, if that makes sense. So just a little bit of fun with version management. But Versionaire does give you that capability. So on to XTG, which is, this has been an interesting one. I had to actually spend about 6 months trying to claim the namespace of this. So if you've ever tried to take a gem that you've wanted so badly to implement, actually you've been implementing under the scenes, but under a terrible name, and you can't talk to the maintainer who's drifted off somewhere, it's a bit tricky to actually get ownership of a gem within Ruby gems. So if you want to know about more of that, we can have a side chat later. But I am now the author or owner of XGG, the namespace at least. And so I've been pushing that forward as well. What I really like about this, and this is something, so kudos to Paul, he got me into this. And it's really kind of changed my view considerably on how to manage CLIs or just command line interfaces in general. And this specification is amazing. A little esoteric, a little dry to read, but it's got some really cool aspects to it. So if you want to learn more, follow this link. And again, these slides will be up so you can dig into them more if you want to. But the main thing is that it gives you a way to configure your CLI or any of your programs for that matter. So the first thing out of the box is XGG gives you 4 major components. And the thing I just want to focus on tonight is config, because we'll get into that from Milestoner. And in this case, I'm configuring it at the global level, so at your home level, right? So globally, you can set it, and then it defines everything for all your projects. What XGG also gives you is the ability to have cache data associated with your program, data itself, and then runtime information, which is a bit fuzzy because it kind of depends on the program that you're writing. There's some technical details that XGG gets into, but the gem itself doesn't do anything with that because it's up to the programmer in that case. So like I said, what's nice about this is it gives you global capabilities to configure your programs. Where Runcom comes into play is it sits on top of XGG, and it actually gives you the ability to basically have a local configuration. So if you want to configure your apps, or in this case, Milestoner, if you want to do just a configuration for your project, so you could have it globally configured, but if you want your local configuration to trump the global configuration, just by setting this path, Runcom will automatically detect that. If it doesn't see that there's anything locally for your project, it'll bounce back to the global configuration and use those settings instead. Pretty cool. The XGG specification doesn't allow for local global kind of dancing, so that's why Runcom is a gem that I built to handle that. Yeah, Dan.
So it doesn't merge local and global, it just says local wins, unless there's no local, then global wins.
Correct. Yeah, and that's a good question, because I've been thinking about, at some point, maybe it might be nice to actually have some merging capabilities. Because if you look at a big project like Rubicon, for example, they do a lot of funny stuff in there when it comes to merging. And it's a little confusing sometimes, and they still have a series of issues that they haven't quite resolved on some of that too. But that gets into some interesting territory when you start to merge things and try to make it intuitive for you as a developer, but also for your customers that might be using your stuff to understand what that all means. So I've kind of kept it simple in this case. Yeah. But again, Runcom also, because it sits on top of XGG, has abilities for cache, data, and runtime as well. And again, it gives you the local capabilities by default and then falls back to global. That's the main thing between Runcom and XGG, those two gems. So what this looks like then, if you put the picture together, is there's your local configuration if you have it for your project, and then fall back to global if it's not there. So then when this comes to the configuration then for Milestoner, there's not a whole lot to configure for it at the moment right yet. But out of the box, you can define these settings, and these are the out of the box default settings. So you could take these settings, slap them into this configuration YAML, and then change the order if you wanted to. Use different prefixes for your Git commits if you wanted to. That's fine. And then you can also turn on Git tag signing so that you have your tag signing automatically happening each time you push out a new version for your project. And just to kind of wrap things up here, some next actions I'd like to do, and there's some things that Paul and I have been kind of bouncing back and forth on for stuff that we're doing at our company, is being able to associate commits with author, so give attribution, right? Because right now when you saw those release notes, right, they're built off the commits, but they don't actually show who the author was. So bringing some of that stuff in would be good. It's also good just for the open source community as a whole. Include the git commit message. So if git commit messages are written really well, have a good subject and a good body, especially with several paragraphs of good information and why you did what you did, not just what, which is the subject of a git commit, that could be really nice, which leads into having a table of contents. So you could build those git commits as the subjects, as your table of contents, and then be able to click on those through either Markdown or maybe ASCII doc or something kind of more rich, and build out a richer set of release notes that are linkable to actually digging into the details of those commit messages and what went into that release. Like I said, other support such as Markdown, ASCII doc, so forth. And one of the big things is I'd like to standardize this at some point. So I'm sort of giving an eye towards Marty over there. I might have to talk to you a little later about maybe eventually being able to talk to Ruby Gems. I'd really like to get in touch with them and kind of propose something so that us as a community as a whole, as you release gems and projects on through Ruby Gems, if we could kind of standardize the way that changelogs are built through maybe tooling like this and other things like that, that means that we could have a nice standardized way for all of us in the community to have these release notes and these changelogs put out consistently for every project. And that would be kind of a huge win for all of us. Even with automation stuff like Depfoo and Dependabot and those other kind of services that you might put in on your team that pull those in, sometimes they fail, and they fail because they can't figure out where the changelog is for the project. They don't have one. Maybe it's under a different name. Maybe it's somewhere else completely. It's just not linked to. So being able to kind of standardize this would be kind of a nice thing to do. And this is kind of a long tail, futuristic kind of view that I have for all this, where I'd like to go with it in the future. But that's all I have. That's kind of Milestoner and some of the dependencies that work underneath there. And hopefully that might be fun for anyone who needs something like that or just wants to toy around with some of these gems. So.
All right, let me say first the last question. So like what we use GitHub Actions heavily in all of our front end projects at my work, where we actually run the conventional commit in that spec against our commits, and if it's not feature or fix or CI or test, it fails it and they have to fix it. Yep. Because we want to have good commit. Why don't you use that spec? I'm curious. You think about conventional commits that work?
Oh, well, just because I'm the author of GitCop too. So GitCop, yeah. I mean, because so on all my CI stuff, especially all my open source stuff, and hopefully eventually we can kind of wrap it into what we're doing at TextUs too at some point. That fails to build the same way. It's kind of like you're describing. So like if they don't adhere to that, the build's just dead. It's like you got to rebase your Git commits and get them into this format before I accept anything. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
And just so people know, you can again get GitHub Actions for stuff like this really easy.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joel.
Yeah. If you just want to be a purist and actually work at the Git level, that's why you'd use things like this or GitCop, right? Not to offend you, Joel, on GitHub, but
and I guess Learner would be the badass JavaScript sort of. So I don't get into that discussion, but the kind of the model repo management for versioning and publishing and commits and changelogs that we use for like all of our libraries.
Okay. Yeah.
It's cool.
Yeah.
So I had an out there question.
Yeah.
Why the name Runcom? Like, does it that doesn't run the commands on the system, does it? Or like
It's it's actually short for run commander. So if you actually look up, I have it in the notes on the gem library itself, but it's an old term for I want to say, maybe you have to help me out here too, Paul. I want to say it's like an old Unix concept. If you look it up, there actually is terminology for these kind of programs that are commanding or kind of doing your configuration runtime stuff. And so run commander is what I chose for that, and I just concatenated those two together. Yeah. Paul.
Why did you pick constipated emoji for this?
So, thanks, Paul. Thanks.
You said you're hiring, right?
So just to fill everybody in, I use a lot of reactions and emoticons in Slack at work because I always try to be very nice, very friendly to the team, versus some folks like Paul.
Unfriendly.
But one of our CTO, when he first saw that, he actually thought I was pooping on him all the time. So I don't know how he conflated the poop emoji with the Japanese or the Asian form of kowtowing and bowing out of respect and dignity for someone else. So that's what I mean by this. But I guess the rest of the team always thinks that I'm shitting on their stuff. So
It's not shitting. It's the opposite of shitting. It's constipated.
This is so bad I cannot even.
It's like this. Is this the squatty potty emoji?
all right.
Good?
I'm good. I'm good. Yeah.
Do you have any more questions?
Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt if anyone wants to. But Dr.
Let's see.
Joel Brooke, if you have any more questions.